Good.
Mike, how are you?
I'm good in quarantine. I'm good.
Yeah, America, but the same as Europe is the same. Very shortly, we won't be able to go across the road. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's another story. Michael, I thank you so much first to find the time to join this. I tell you where this subject that I had an idea about, one of many. Um, I've always felt, as you know, I've been working in the rock industry for many years before I joined audio, but I never was able to travel a lot to the States, which meant that all the contents, I would get it through the record labels and the companies with very short press releases, mean that my knowledge of a certain part of the rock industry or the in this case, the garage punk industry or psychedelic rock was very limited to me. So I decided to address myself to specialists like yourself that were there at the time, and and then maybe we could cover the subject a little more in depth. So the idea is, as we discussed or we had a quick briefing about, is that I would pick up a band which would represent a certain style of music for the area, for the time, in a specific state, and we could discuss the band, the style, the label, and maybe a little bit of geopolitics of what would be happening in that state. So forgive me for being speaking ahead, but now in a minute you'll be the first band I picked up. So the subject is really garage punk, but because this band really, I think you will agree, is not only garage punk, it probably falls on the psychedelic rock, would you say as well?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Okay, so we picked
I didn't
up.
really think they were doing that, but that's what they were doing.
So we picked up 13 Floor Elevators, of which I've got 3 albums, which that I believe it to be the first one, which was on a label called International Artist, which was, I think, the label that followed them most of their career. Then we've got, I think that was the third album, Bull of the Woods, again on International Artist.
I don't
Was that the third or the second one? I think that's
have.
probably
That's the third one, I think.
third one. And then
I
we've
think
got East Everywhere, which is again under the same label.
yeah, that to me is the great one.
It's the great one, I agree. And then no, I'm not going to show the last one. It's probably East Everywhere was probably Michael's favorite, and it is definitely a great, great album. We're talking about Texas, aren't we, Michael, at the time?
So, the first thing I wanted to say, because I can't say that I'm an academic on the subject of Texas psychedelic rock or even the 13th Floor Elevator or even Rocky Erickson. I'm not an academic expert, but I just wanted to go back and say this really started everything as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
And this started everything. And the Pacific Northwest is a hotbed of all of this stuff. And you could argue that the Ventures, even though they didn't sing, there was a big thing made about the Beatles. They played their own instruments. Well, the Ventures played their own instruments. All the surf bands that started before the Beatles played their own instruments. They just didn't sing. So I just want to make that point. So, Rocky Erickson was an outlier. He formed this band, and they never were big when they were first out. It wasn't the one hit song, You're Gonna Miss Me. That was a minor hit as far as I know. And at that point in America, everything was regionalized. Things that were regionalized did become hits nationwide only when the record labels, mostly in New York or LA, picked them up and made them hits. You could say that about the stuff that came out of New Orleans. you know, Ernie K. Doe and Mother-in-Law, and even Fats Domino, all those things came out of local music scenes, and the powers that be on the coasts would pick these things up, the small labels up, and make them hits. I don't think this band really ever broke as a band in America. It was not a well-known band. It was all of these groups were like one-hit wonders, and then they sort of faded into the ooze until later. And that's why it was not until you know, this record came out. You know this record, I'm sure.
Oh, fantastic record.
Yeah. So I actually wrote, this is a promo copy. I did the national radio spot for this record, and I couldn't find, I've got it here someplace, and I wanted to play it for you, but I couldn't find it. But I do have a letter from Lenny K right here.
Oh, whoa.
And Lenny said, because I somehow sent him a tape with the commercial and also some funny parodies that I did. And he said, thanks for sending the really weird parodies, and Nuggets add, you're really quite a chucklesome guy.
Well, Michael, there's nobody better than you to explain us a little bit. Shall we first start with try to position in time by referring to other more popular artists? Where would, for example, this Texas scene would fit in with general nationwide or even international hit makers? So which period are we talking about really in terms of
66? This record is 66. So by 66, the Beatles had happened. All the kids all over America were picking up guitars, the ones that hadn't picked it up before. Because like I say, there are other bands that were making music before the Beatles. You know, the Kingsmen. This is 62, I think, or maybe 63. And you could say this really started everything. And there are other groups, you know, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Sonics.
Oh, fantastic. I love this album. Which period is the Sonics?
This was also around 63, I think. No, this is 66. But, you know, let's give Bob Irwin at Sundays credit. He really scoured the country, and he dug up all of these regional bands. Soma Records out of Minneapolis. He's got three records from this group. You know, kids picking up guitars and doing it. So you know, international. This is international artist records. How they picked up this group, and you look at this record, and it's very difficult to figure out how they managed it. But on the back here, it talks about who made the 13th Floor Elevator successful. You know, the independent music sales in San Francisco, Denny Zeitler, Gordon Bynum, record producer, Chuck Dunaway of a radio station in Houston, Campus Records distribution in Miami, Florida. I mean, it's all the indie record distributors, and they mention them all on the back of this record. And it seems like the album came out after the single came out first. That was a big hit, as big as it was. I don't think it rose up the charts. Then they had to put an album together because albums were starting to happen at that point in time. So they put an album together, and this one is not. It's only okay. I mean, you look at this record. It's Rocky Erickson wrote one song, and then there were a couple of songs that were by him and another guy in the band. And then You're Gonna Miss Me was produced by Gordon Bynum separately, as you can see on this. And it was recorded in Dallas, Texas. And a different producer produced the other songs. So this album was basically, let's get an album out there because kids are starting to buy albums. And that's why it's not that strong a record. And that's why the second one, this one is a more fully polished package. And this is the same producer that produced, this is from 67, the same producer that produced the other songs on the first album produced this one. And this one, and they cover a Bob Dylan song, but this one is the band is more a fully formed sound. There's that psychedelic kind of blah, 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 blah thing going on in the background, and You know, I don't know what else I can tell you about it. I can't say that I am an academic on the subject of the
No, but
13th.
I'd like, there's one thing that obviously you have to see when we people were on this side of the ocean. These things were very obscure and they were not, as you just said, even in the
Right.
States, they were not, but they represent, and I'm very pleased you mentioned the Kingsmen, because everybody thinks that guitars and rock music from that period, what we call the Beat generation, that it's them that created everything out of the UK. I don't agree with that. I think
That's not
we have to respect the British bands, but I think some of these British bands, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're from the right side of the pond there, were inspired by some of the US more roots type of blues and jazz players.
of course.
And but then, like you said, then you have the Kingsmen that were already doing it before. Were they doing it before the Beatles and all this Beat generation? I guess
And
so, no?
the Beach Boys too. I mean, the Beach Boys were early '60s that they got started. So they were, but they were inspired by the Four Freshmen. I mean, all this thing is all a continuous. It's only unique if you don't know the history. Then all of a sudden something appears, but nothing appears. It all, you know, grows from something. And you know, the famous story about Liverpool, how the sailors would come into port and they'd bring records from America, and that's how the Beatles and all the other groups from there heard about all this music. It wasn't being played on the local radio. It came in on records. And you know, what you guys call Northern Soul is really came from American singles, from
Absolutely, absolutely. No,
labels, and that's how it all got fed. So I don't think anybody could say it started in the UK. You know, the UK brought our music back to American kids because of race problems in America. Unless you were going into black areas, or you were, you know, listening to stations in New York that was catering to black listeners, you didn't hear that music. You didn't hear blues. It was called race music, and you didn't hear race music. It was more easily assimilated in Europe because Europe didn't have as much racism as America. So that's
correct.
why all the jazz musicians left America for Scandinavia and for France, where they were more welcomed and where jazz was and blues are more appreciated. And then it came back to America to kids through the British bands. So it's a cross mingling of, I mean, the whole history of it is pretty amazing when you think about it. It just goes back and forth. And so no one owns any of it, although you could easily argue that, I mean, the blues started in America, and then it was not known to Americans except for the aficionados who picked up on it, and then it went to England, and then they fed it back to even country and western. You know, the Beatles, George Harrison, they were way into country and western music. And what I remember when a lot of those songs came out on the early Beatle albums, where George was picking country and western stuff on his big, was a Gretsch guitar, I think. I didn't hear any of that stuff growing up. That was in the South. I didn't hear none of that till the Beatles brought it over for me to hear.
I guess so. I guess they helped popularize it, but the point is that you had the music there in the first place. That's what I'm trying to.
It was ghettoized. So you know, that's how the whole thing split open. You could say the internet is, you know, the big exploder of things, but really what happened was when the music came back to America, where it started, white America was not exposed to it until it came back from white Brits, and that's ironic. You know,
It is exactly, and you know what? I'm a little more extreme than you because, as you can see from behind, I'm a great fan of what you call U.S. garage punk as well as other music. Don't worry, listeners. I'm actually have a lovely classic collection. I have a lovely jazz collection, but I have as well a great fan of U.S. garage punk and from the '60s. The Remains, the Sonics, Music Machine, Shadows of the Night, blah, 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 blah. And down to my favorite one, which is a little single band that made one single called Dirty Filthy Mud, which is an incredible mix of garage punk and psychedelia. But what I like about this movement of the 60s is that suddenly, the way I perceive it from this side of the pond, British rock became polite by comparison. And so we could say that even bands like the Animals or the Yardbirds were suddenly polite by comparison to what some of these US garage punk bands were doing. And
everybody came out of colleges. You know, a lot of these players, they went to art school and colleges, and then they formed bands. But in America, these kids were more rough and tumble to a great degree. And also, you got to remember, America's a big place. So
yeah,
the Pacific Northwest is a different country from Florida. It's a different country. And so all these different musical styles came out, whereas the UK was a much smaller place. It was much more confined. Anybody making waves in one part of the UK would be heard all over the UK, I suppose. I wasn't there, so I don't know, but I would have.
and well, I can tell you, you're probably very correct in your. I mean, there were different sounds, as you know. We had here in the UK, we had the beat, we had the psychedelic as well, we had hard rock or heavy metal at the time. So you know, but well, I think that for some reason, the wildness of the music got much more developed. The sort of craziness. For example, 13th floor elevators, I think it's a good expression of this movement, but other states had other music. And I was told, and correct me if I'm wrong, that kids in America really wanted to be appreciated by the girls, and more than being famous on the thing. And that was a big way of expressing themselves, being part of a band, wearing cool clothes and making wild sounds. Would you agree that that would be correct?
I think that's every time you read about a band starting up or someone getting into music, I don't care where in the world it was, they would say, oh, I saw this got the girls going, so I'm going to do that. And I heard a story yesterday. I guess I can repeat it, from a friend of mine who worked at a record store in Boston in the 60s, and he came outside of his of the store, and there was like a 16-year-old Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, just who used to play on the street with these two young girls, and very attractive, and so he followed them, and then these two girls ended up making all of Steven Tyler's clothing. But everybody would say, who's hanging out with, who's got the girls? And it's the musicians.
And the musician.
So you pick up a guitar, even if you can't play it, and you get on the stage, and that guitar becomes a really big dick. Pardon my French. And that's what it was all about. So yeah, but that's not an American phenomenon necessarily.
Yeah, and so can you give me, for example, an idea of what would be going on in Texas at the time, more or less? We're talking 1966. What would it be a real, what was happening there in your, I mean, I know you were not from Texas, but you certainly know more than we would know here too.
Well, I mean, Kennedy got shot there in '63. That probably freaked out a lot of people. And Texas was at that point, was a very democratic state. People forget that. And so the politics were different than they are now, although it was still pretty, there was rural Texas. There was Buddy Holly came out of Texas. I mean, but again, there are small towns in Texas that are like, at that point in time, that were different countries as far as people were concerned, because the communications and the infrastructure of traveling was not what it is now. So little groups could come out of a small, like Buddy Holly could come out of a small town in Lubbock, Texas, and end up on the Ed Sullivan Show. Yeah, that could happen too. So at the same time as it was small, there were people that could make that leap, you know. And Buddy Holly ended up in New York recording with strings in within a couple of years of coming out of rural Texas or small town Texas. He was in New York recording with a string orchestra. So I don't know.
I guess that it was a bit early, would you say, for, because I believe now Austin and Houston are two big music centers in America, aren't they?
Austin especially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Austin wouldn't have existed by then, would it, as a center?
You know, I think one thing about America is there were a lot of small recording studios and a lot of entrepreneurial small radio stations, because in the UK, you didn't have a lot of small radio stations. It was all filtered through the BBC, correct, for a long time. So it was a very narrow pipeline. And in America, you had all these little rural AM stations. You had little recording studios set up all over the place. You had, you know, kids buying guitars and playing, and then being played on their music being played on covered by the local small radio station, and then being recorded at small studios. I mean, if you look at this label, where did International Records go after?
I don't know. I love this label, by the way.
International Artists Producing Corp, Houston, Texas. I'm not sure I heard of them before or after. So, and a lot of the small labels ended up, of course, getting bought out by consolidated into the big labels. But for a long time, it was small indie labels working alongside the few majors, you know, RCA, Columbia, whatever, and they weren't touching a lot of this stuff. You know, Columbia could see what was happening, but they didn't touch rock. They were above rock until the Byrds, and you know, Dylan's a whole different thing. And all these small labels were releasing their own stuff on their own small labels and having regional hits. And you know, the hip kids were finding out about this other music, but most kids, they were listening to top 40 radio, and they only heard what was being filtered through top 40 radio. So,
but would you agree that it was a very creative part or era of the rock scene of the last 50 years? I mean, it was very interesting sounds produced by bands like those, you know. But
you know, this record, going back to this record.
Oh, I love this record because it combines them all.
All the bands that are on here are, this record came out in 72. 72. And I would say a majority of the people that might have bought this record did not know a lot of these bands until they bought this record. Some of the songs were hits. You know, Electric Prunes, they were on reprise. But the Standells' Dirty Water, that was a hit. A lot of these songs were hits, but people heard them as hits and then they disappeared, and they didn't know where they came from. They didn't, like, I remember I didn't know that Ernie K. Doe was from New Orleans. I didn't know that sound. I knew the sound was interesting, but I didn't know that there was a whole sound in New Orleans. And if I went down there, I'd hear a lot of music that had that swampy sound. I just knew that one song. Or I knew Fats Domino, but I didn't connect.
Yeah, no, I can see. Well, I guess it's the same with me. I mean, it took me years to realize what was from Texas or Chicago or Houston or whatever part of America. But obviously, what I thought was interesting is that those sounds were very creative. They were a big contribution to the psychedelic area and the garage rock area that represents, for me, a great part of the industry, you know?
Yeah, if you read Lenny Kaye's notes on the back of this, it's really, they're saying everything we're saying. Because what he's saying is that it's a story of a transition period in American rock and roll, you know, when everything was moving so fast that everybody knew much of what to make of what was all around, only noticeable in retrospect by the vast series of innovations that would eventually spawn both in the singles music and the way it was listened to. Nobody knew what was going on. These songs were showing up, becoming hits, and then disappearing. And nobody was saying, well, where did that come from? I've got to go. Nobody was paying attention. It's just because the stuff was so fast. It was, oh, that's a good song. That's a good song. It's only in retrospect, like he says, that you go back and you can put together a package like this and say, this is from the Northwest, this is from the Southwest, this is Texas, this is, you know, Spokane, or this is wherever. And then you put it all together and you say, ah, I see. These are all things happening at the same time in different places, but they're all interrelated in one way or another. And how they're related is what you're talking about. I think that hasn't been really, no one's gone back to these different towns and said, what was happening in that town that made these kids do that? What made people pick up a guitar, and aside from the girl side of it, pick up a guitar in 61 before the Beatles? What made the Beatles pick up a guitar? All these different people picking up guitars, you know, these kids, and doing what they're doing. They hardly do it today. You know, if you want to, the music that white kids are making today is so pathetic.
Oh my God, don't they, those feminine voices that all the guys are using is awful.
No testosterone. I see there's a show in New York on Saturday morning that Anthony Mason, what used to be the host of, and he's a music fanatic, and these kids would come on every Saturday morning, and they'd have these man buns, and they would stand there and they would sing into their and no one's going, hey! None of them. They're such a bunch of wusses. So all the energy is coming out of rap. You know, that's where the energy is for the most part. There's no energy coming out of these white kids. They're just, I don't understand it. Is it the is it the feminine hormones in the water? I don't know what it is, but there's no guts. There's nobody screaming. And there's plenty to scream about now, and nobody's screaming. I don't get it.
So, yeah, I know the kids today that just don't get it. But these type of sounds that, I mean, you know, can you maybe give a few, what type of youth would we call this part of the drug scene, or did you have to take drugs to enjoy that type of music, or?
I don't think you had to take drugs to enjoy the music. What was making kids enjoy the music was the primal energy of it. You know, it was the energy. It was most of these kids were, you know, working class kids coming out of either semi-suburban areas. They certainly weren't coming out of the wealthy areas of the suburbs. They were coming out of the scrappier areas. And these were the kids who worked on their own cars. You know, these were kids who were mechanically inclined. And so a guitar was almost an extension of an engine in some ways. And an amplifier was an extension of an engine to me. And
that makes a lot of sense, Michael. And this is probably why you had so much diversity. It was probably due to the fact that you had such a big land and everybody was being creative. Well, I mean, you know, we're going to have more chapters on these. I just want to remind our friends from my side, and maybe you could have a word, that audio is not only about audiophile records, and that some of these records are not really great in terms of engineering technique, but they represent a very important part of the history of music, and therefore they should be heard on a good system as well, with whatever flaws they might present in an audiophile way. But who cares? Eventually the music wins, you know?
You know, a lot of them are very simply recorded and engineered because they had nothing else. So
exactly.
A couple of microphones into a tape recorder, it doesn't get any purer than that. And if you have halfway a notion of what you're doing and what you're hearing, you can produce something that sounds good. You know, I mean, Norman Petty, look what Norman Petty produced in his studio for Buddy Holly. Those recordings are unbelievably good.
Unbelievably good. You're right. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say, I want people that follow us or follow me a little bit, that we're not all about audiophile quality records.
No,
that it doesn't.
That's the worst. That's the worst kind of stereotype, no pun intended, that there is. That audiophiles don't like music. They only play Stevie Ray Vaughan, Tin Pan Alley, and Dire Straits.
John Armour Trading, Dire Straits.
And nothing wrong with that stuff. Is, you know, not necessarily my favorite, but certainly Stevie Ray Vaughan was a great guitarist. But you know, I play stuff that's really horrible sounding and stuff that's great sounding. But when you play it on a good system, you hear the horrible sound as good as it's going to sound, and you hear it documented as what it is. And I have no problem playing those. If it's horrible, no. You know, like this version of, so I have two versions of this record. I don't have an original because they're too costly, but I have this gatefold version that came out of Italy on Get Back Records, and this was licensed from Charlie, so it's not a bootleg, but they chose to do an electronically reprocessed for stereo version of it, and it's terrible because the whole point of this music is it's raw and it's direct, and instead this version sounds horrible. It just sounds like it's underwater because they added echo to it and they split the channels up. It's just plain old stupid. This version, what version?
The copy I have says is stereo 1A number 1. But yeah, I agree. But this is why I don't get involved. But I don't want to open that subject with you today because you're going to convince. I always buy originals rather than these 180 grams or 240 grams reissues. But obviously, I've got respect for some of the labels that do it. So
this one, Bob Irwin did this one from the mono tape. You know.
Wow.
My issue with Bob, and Bob gets the tapes. He gets the original tapes. My issue with Bob is he doesn't cut from the tape. He'll produce a CD resolution master, and they cut from that. And that's what most of the Sundays are. And, you know, he gets mad at me when I tell the truth, but I tell the truth. And they sound pretty good. Not as good as they could sound, but pretty good.
If you keep the raw effect. I love the way you said raw. This is why I'm so much into garage punk at the moment, 60s America. It represents the wildness, the youth, the sort of saying we don't want to be part of this establishment. And I think great sounds, imperfect, detuned guitars. Where did I hear recently? I think it was the Remains did a concert in Boston, and the guy gets on stage, a reunion concert, and he says, listen, I've got to detune this guitar, because that's what made it so attractive, the garage punk scene of the time, and full of energy.
Anybody could pick up a guitar and play it. But there's also, you know, to a certain degree, that's also an excuse for sloppiness. And at some point, it's like, okay, let's see what you can do when you put the thing in tune, because that counts too, as far as I'm concerned.
That's true. Well, and we know that the Sex Pistols were not such bad musicians at the end, but that was much later. And I'm trying to say that in the U.S. there was a huge mine, and thanks to these albums, the Nuggets, and many others that came out later, you can experiment all these incredible sounds from the U.S. And I want to thank you so much, Michael, for throwing some light of what was happening there. Of course, you were not born at the time, so you didn't experience it. But
that's right. I had to grow up. You know, I didn't really wake up until I was like 15 in 1980 something. So I don't. But you know, the point is, I'm not an academic. I don't claim to be. I cannot sit here and give you a history of international, you know, of the label and where it came from. I'm sure there are people who have done that kind of work. I haven't done the work, so, and I didn't have time to even do the work and prepare it. But what's interesting is what you learn everything you need to know about the back, about this record from the back, from reading the names and reading the places where the one stops live. You know, do people know what a one stop is now? I'm not sure. Like, in America.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
I mean, the guy that owned the record store that I used to do the commercials for in the 70s he had 3 record stores in Boston, and he had a one stop. A one stop was a place, he had a place in Meridian, Connecticut, where he distributed all the indie labels, you know, A&M, and you want to list all the indie labels at that point. Nobody had a distribution arm for them. You know, Columbia had a distribution arm all over the country, and they just self-distributed. RCA self-distributed, but these smaller labels didn't have the ability to self-distribute. So these guys ran one-stops, and the one-stops is where a small record store could say, give me 2 copies of that, give me 1 copy of that, give me 3 copies of that, and then have them shipped to them. And so if you look on the back of this record, you'll see all these small indie distributors are being thanked because they are like the infrastructure. And the same with
Wow.
radio stations. You know, Gary Stites and Joe Stanzione of Campus Record Distribution, Miami, Florida. Carol Darling of Concord Distribution, Cleveland, Ohio. Armin Baladi and his crew at Record Distribution, Detroit. Jerry Love of Alpha Distributors of New York City. I mean, it's all, you read that and you have, without knowing any of it, you have a history of what record distribution and what the record business was like for small labels in America in the 60s and through the 70s until, you know, even Warner Brothers was independently distributed until in the early 70s. They decided to set up their own distribution. You know, Warner Electra Atlantic, WEA, set up this distribution in Boston. I was around when that happened. And you know, that's the weird thing. I saw it. I really didn't understand it. I was doing the commercials for the stores. And then I saw that this WEA set up this distribution network outside of Boston, and all these records were in this store. And that started taking away the distribution from the smaller distributors, because now the labels are setting up their own, and it created this pressure that changed the business. But I'm not sure anybody's written a book about all that, and I'm not sure that many people are interested in it. I know I am. I know
I am very interested in it, very interested, because it's such a mine. And unfortunately, I don't think the streamers are too worried about all this stuff. So these hard copies or the tapes, or even people that have cassettes, should keep them safely, because I don't think that in a few years the streamers would be bothered about things like that.
You know, a stream by definition just floats right past you. That's what, you know, something floating in a stream, it goes past you, even if, and then it's gone out of your memory. And, you know, Andy Warhol was right. 15 minutes of fame. Actually, he overstated it. It's like 3 minutes of fame. I know a guy who makes disco mixes, you know, for clubs. And he said to me, at this point in time, you make a disco record, you know, a club song, it goes out, it's popular for like 2 days. And then it's gone to the next one. It's like,
yeah, it's nothing that you can hang on to. Listen, Michael, I'm being told that this Zoom is being limited. So I want to thank you, but we got to do a few more. And thank you so much, and enjoy the music.
of course, as soon as I hang up from you, I'll be back there doing that.
Yeah, me too, me too. You can see the deck is still behind, but it's going to be played in a few minutes. Take care.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.